I still remember the light from my laptop. It was the only thing cutting through the darkness of the living room. Everything else was still. The house, the air, even my heartbeat for a moment, held itself still. His name popped up at the top of my inbox. Subject: for the sake of honesty. There were no attachments, no warning, just a few short lines that cracked open the ground beneath me. I've found someone who gives me everything you couldn't. I've moved your inheritance into my personal account. Let's keep this clean. No need for drama. I read it once. Then again. The words didn't shift. They just settled, like dust over a long-forgotten memory. And then I typed, "Thank you for the update." Click send. Closed the laptop. Not a single tear fell. Not then. Not after. Because long before that email arrived, I had stopped believing in the man who sent it. He thought this message would break me, but what he didn't know was that I had already traced the outlines of his betrayal months ago. Quietly, carefully, without confrontation or chaos. And I wasn't sitting in that silence because I was stunned. I was sitting in that silence because I was ready. You see, there's a difference between being blindsided and being silent on purpose. He mistook my stillness for ignorance. What he never realized was that every step he took away from me, I had documented. Every account, every transfer, every whisper of doubt, I followed it all. He thought he had the upper hand because he sent the first blow, but I had already written the ending before he wrote the opening line. And the ending? He wouldn't see it coming. He wouldn't even recognize it until he was drowning in it. If this is your first time finding one of our stories, welcome. Take a second, tap that like button, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel, and don't scroll away. Because what happened after I hit send changed everything, forever. We met on a Thursday afternoon, one of those days that slips between memory and routine. I was balancing a coffee in one hand, a stack of resumes in the other, and he held the door open for me like we were in a scene written by fate. We started talking in the break room a week later. He asked about the novel I was reading. I asked why he wore cufflinks on casual Fridays. There was something easy about him then. Confident, but not loud. Thoughtful, with a hint of mystery. He made the everyday feel extraordinary. We were co-workers at first, colleagues who lingered a little too long at each other's desks, who laughed a little too hard at inside jokes. One late work night turned into dinner. Dinner turned into weekends. Weekends turned into holidays with his family, where I was introduced as the one. By the time I realized I had fallen for him, we were already talking about our future. We moved into a tiny apartment with squeaky floors and drafty windows. But to us it was a palace. Every hand-me-down couch, every chipped mug. We treated them like treasures because they were ours. Our wedding wasn't grand. We couldn't afford a ballroom or string quartets, but we danced barefoot in my mother's backyard under a string of mismatched lights. I wore my sister's veil. He couldn't stop smiling. And in that moment nothing felt missing. When he got the job offer in another state, I packed up my life without hesitation. I told my boss I'd be taking a break, just for a little while. Just until he got settled. I shelved my plans, my graduate applications, my own ambitions. Not because he asked, but because I believed in us, in our shared future. In the dream we were building, even if it meant I was pouring more than I was receiving. He was always charming in public, knew just the right things to say. But behind closed doors, I began to notice subtle shifts. Decisions were no longer made together. He started correcting me in conversations, dismissing my suggestions with a casual laugh. If I pushed back, he'd accuse me of being too sensitive, too dramatic, too difficult to please. It wasn't yelling. It wasn't cruelty. It was silence when I needed reassurance. It was forgetfulness when I needed presence. It was making me feel like I owed him gratitude for things we were both supposed to carry. But I told myself all couples go through this. I told myself that sacrifices were the currency of love. We kept going. Birthday dinners, anniversaries. Shared calendars filled with reminders that we were still partners. He never hit. Never raised his voice. That's what I used to tell myself when I felt something slip between us. We were a team, or so I believed. I carried the emotional weight. He carried the illusion. And year after year I stayed. Because love once upon a time had felt real. And because I still hoped somewhere deep in the quiet that it could feel that way again. But it didn't. It never came back. And I stopped waiting. In the beginning, his business trips were occasional, 3 days here, a week there. First, I barely noticed the distance. We'd talk at night, share quick updates, trade blurry FaceTime calls. I missed him, but I trusted him. I thought that was enough. Then the trips grew longer, more frequent, less spontaneous. He started packing with a kind of efficiency that felt rehearsed. I'd ask questions, where, when, who, with, and his answers were always just vague enough to quiet me but never quite enough to satisfy. The calls became shorter. The replies delayed. The photos he used to send from hotel lobbies or airport lounges stopped coming altogether. I chalked it up to stress, the demands of a growing business, the weight of being the provider. And I played my role. I kept the home running, scheduled the dentist appointments, folded the laundry, managed the silence. Then my father passed. Grief is strange. It sharpens some things and dulls others. I remember standing in his study the day after the funeral, holding the letter he left me. My name written in his familiar hand. Inside, a list of assets. Property, stocks, savings I had never even known about. It felt overwhelming. And he, my husband, he stepped in like a savior. He wrapped his arms around me, whispered that we'd handle it together, that he'd take the burden off my shoulders, that I didn't need to worry. At first, I was grateful. He offered to call the bank, to speak with the lawyer, to simplify the paperwork. He made it seem like he was protecting me from overwhelm, but something in me hesitated. Something I couldn't name. He started suggesting we consolidate accounts, for efficiency, he said. He brought home stacks of documents, highlighted places for me to sign, always with a kiss on my forehead and a gentle, "You don't need to read all that. It's just the formalities." I signed. Because I trusted him. Because in my fog of grief, I couldn't imagine duplicity hiding behind the hands that held me while I cried. At the same time, my mother's health began to decline. I was driving her to appointments, managing prescriptions, watching her fade in pieces. Consumed me. I was living in two worlds, mourning one parent while slowly losing another. The days blended into nights, and my own needs disappeared beneath the weight of caretaking. I stopped paying attention to the little things. The way he changed passwords without telling me. The new credit cards that arrived in his name but somehow affected our shared balances. The unfamiliar voices that called late at night and hung up when I answered. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was tired, that marriage meant trusting, even when it felt uncomfortable. But somewhere in my body a quiet alarm was going off. Not loud, just steady, and I kept silencing it. Because to question him meant unraveling everything I thought I knew. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. At first, the change was so subtle I almost convinced myself it was nothing. A shorter hug. A distracted nod. The kind of silence that doesn't stem from comfort but from absence. He began pulling away, not physically but emotionally. He was in the room but no longer with me. His eyes would gloss over when I spoke. His responses clipped, almost mechanical. I'd ask about his day and he'd mutter, "It was fine," before retreating to his phone or locking himself in the study. The warmth in his voice grew cold, like he was always one question away from snapping. Even the smallest things like asking what he wanted for dinner could spark a sigh, a glare, or that tired phrase, "Why are you always overthinking?" He kept telling me he was under pressure, that work was suffocating, that I was adding stress. I believed him, because I wanted to. Because if I accepted anything else, I'd have to admit something was breaking. His phone became his shadow, always in his pocket, always face down on the counter. I caught him flinching once when I walked into the room too suddenly. He locked the screen faster than I could blink, then plastered on a half smile and asked if I needed anything. I tried brushing it off. One day, I asked to borrow it. Mine was dead. He hesitated. Just for a second. But that hesitation said more than words ever could. Still, he handed it over, after what felt like a silent battle in his own mind. It was empty. Scrubbed. Messages gone. Browser cleared. No missed calls, no texts, no emails. Just a home screen and a forced smile behind it. When I questioned the vanishing messages, he laughed. That laugh that makes you feel ridiculous just for speaking. He said I was being paranoid, insecure, dramatic, that I needed help if I didn't trust my own husband. He twisted my concern into an accusation against me. Said I was too emotional. That I was imagining problems because I was bored. And maybe for a moment I believed it. Maybe I wanted to believe that the problem was me. That if I just adjusted, loved harder, gave more space, he'd come back. But then I started noticing the lies. Little ones at first, saying he was in one place when his location showed another, claiming he had meetings that didn't exist, slipping up on details he'd already shared. When I confronted him gently, his reaction was swift deflection, blame, irritation. He said I was nagging, that I was making things up just to start a fight, that I needed to get a hobby instead of tracking his life. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, on our marriage, on myself. I started questioning my memory, my judgment. I wrote things down just to prove to myself later that I wasn't losing my mind. Then a friend, a brutally honest one, pulled me aside one afternoon. She didn't ask questions. She just looked at me long and hard and said, "He's acting like a man who's already checked out." I didn't cry in front of her. I nodded, smiled, changed the subject. But that night, when the house was quiet and he was away again, I sat in the dark, holding my own hands like they were the only safety I had left, and the shame washed over me like a tide I hadn't seen coming. Was it something I did? Was I too much? Not enough? Had I missed some signal years ago? I replayed every conversation, every moment, searching for clues, like peeling apart a puzzle I didn't know had been broken from the start. My confidence began to erode. My appetite disappeared. I started avoiding mirrors, skipping calls, shrinking into corners of my own home. I didn't want to talk to anyone, because I didn't know how to explain something that was unraveling without evidence. I kept asking myself, if he didn't love me anymore, why didn't he just say it? But deep down I was terrified of the answer. And even more terrified that I already knew it. I stopped asking him questions. Not because I trusted him again, but because I had finally begun to trust myself. Silence became my strategy. Each morning, before the rest of the house woke up, I carved out a sliver of peace. I'd sit at the kitchen table with a blank page and a pen, and I'd write. Not for clarity at first, but to survive. Words poured out that I hadn't dared speak aloud. Each line was a lifeline. Each sentence a mirror. I wrote about the coldness in his eyes, the lies dressed as love, the ache of not being seen. Eventually, I found a therapist, quietly, privately. I told no one. For 1 hour a week, I said things I didn't even know were buried inside me. There were no accusations, no blame games. Just truth, unfiltered, uncomfortable truth. She didn't tell me what to do. She just held up a mirror and asked, "Is this the life you want?" That question haunted me for weeks. I started revisiting old hobbies, photography, painting, books I'd once read with a highlighter in hand. I had forgotten how much of myself I'd shelved in order to be who he wanted. The real shift came one night, sitting cross-legged on the floor, sorting through a box of receipts for tax season. One document caught my eye. A withdrawal from an account I didn't recognize. First, I thought it was a mistake, a routing error. But as I sifted deeper, I uncovered more. Scattered pieces pointing to large amounts moved quietly over months. The numbers didn't lie. They painted a picture of someone planning something. I found a printout from the investment folder he once insisted I sign without reading, calling it just paperwork. My stomach turned. I took the documents and locked them in a drawer. Then I logged into every bank account I had access to. Slowly, carefully. That's when I saw it. My father's inheritance, gone. Or at least most of it. Dispersed into a business account I had never authorized, tied to a company I didn't even know existed. He hadn't just lied. He had taken. And I didn't scream. I didn't storm into the living room and demand an explanation. I made a copy. Then another. I backed up everything to a secure drive. I started a new folder on my laptop labeled Quiet Prep. I wasn't preparing for confrontation. I was preparing for freedom. A friend of mine, a lawyer I hadn't spoken to in months, came to mind. I sent a message under the guise of catching up. We met for coffee 2 days later. I didn't bring the files. I just asked a few hypothetical questions. She listened without judgment. She never asked if I was okay. She knew. Her advice was calm, deliberate. Don't alert him. Gather. Protect. Stay quiet. So I did. I requested copies of old statements from the bank. I met with an accountant on my lunch break. I opened a new savings account under my maiden name. At home I cooked dinner like nothing had changed. I smiled at the kids. I folded his shirts, even ironed them. But every step I took was one brick closer to the exit I was quietly building. I didn't want revenge. I wanted my life back. I wanted to feel my own voice echo inside my chest and not be afraid of it. I wanted to stop waking up with that feeling in my gut. The one that whispers, "This isn't love anymore." And most of all, I wanted the next chapter of my life to begin on my terms. So I kept writing, and watching, and waiting. He said he needed space. That's how he framed it, like he was doing me a favor. A few days away to clear his head, to focus on a pitch, to breathe without the pressure of home life. San Diego, he claimed. A tech conference. A week-long itinerary. I smiled, nodded, packed his shaving kit like always. But this time, I didn't offer a goodbye kiss. I simply stepped aside. He didn't notice. The morning after he left, the house was quiet, too quiet. I dropped the kids at school, brewed a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen island, laptop open. Emails pinged in. Work. Reminders. Newsletters. Then. His name. Subject line. Let's keep things civil. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. Something deeper kicked in. A stillness I didn't expect. I opened the message. Slowly. I didn't want to do this over email, but I thought it best to avoid unnecessary conflict. I've met someone. She gives me everything you couldn't. Emotionally. Physically. She reminds me who I am. I've already moved the funds from your father's estate into my personal business account. It makes more sense that way. I've built this life. I've maintained this house. I've paid the dues. Let's avoid drama. We're adults. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I'll reach out next week to discuss logistics. I hope you'll be reasonable. I read it twice. Not for clarity. For confirmation. This wasn't a breakup. This was a clean theft dressed in cowardice. He didn't just leave. He had calculated an exit, rewritten our story as though I had been a passenger in his journey, not the woman who sacrificed a decade and a half to build him. I stared at the screen for a long while. Not because I was in shock, but because I'd already seen this coming. I had all the evidence, lined up like dominoes. He just assumed I was blind. So I replied. 10 words. No emotion. No question marks. No please. Thank you for the update. I wish you clarity. Then I hit send. And closed the laptop. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't call anyone. I sat there, in a pool of my own silence, and let the last illusion fall. This man, who once called me his anchor, had become a ghost in his own home long before he physically walked out. The money? I'd mourned that lost the day I confirmed the transfers. The betrayal? That seed had already grown roots. This email was just confirmation. He didn't break me, he revealed himself. I walked to the mirror and stared at my own face. No mascara tracks, just me, still standing. And suddenly, for the first time in years, I wasn't scared. Because he thought I'd be blindsided. But he had no idea that the woman he tried to discard was already 10 steps ahead. What he didn't know could have filled volumes. Because while he was busy planning an exit, I was laying down a foundation he couldn't undo. 2 months before that email ever reached my inbox, I'd already begun shifting the ground beneath his feet. It started after a phone call from my father's lawyer. One I almost didn't take because I was folding laundry and the baby was teething. But I did. And that call changed everything. He told me something wasn't adding up. Transactions. Transfers. Signatures. And a creeping sense that someone was moving my assets with intent. That was the first night I didn't sleep. But not from panic, from clarity. The next morning I didn't ask questions. I took action. I met with a new attorney, one who specialized in asset protection, not just probate. We had a quiet meeting over tea, no paper trail tied to the house, no emails that he could stumble across. Just facts. Within 2 weeks I had created a trust in my name only. Everything, my father's land, the stocks, the dividend accounts, the life insurance policies, was rerouted. Quietly. Legally. Irrevocably. I changed the beneficiaries. Pulled my name from every account we once shared. Froze the joint account the day after he left for Atlanta. Not San Diego, he'd lied even about that. He didn't know I was no longer the naive woman he once married. I'd stopped asking for permission. And then I left a trail. Oh, not the kind you follow. The kind that leads to exposure. A careful breadcrumb of financial records, access logs, printouts, emails forwarded to a backup address he never knew existed. I even walked into our family bank branch with my lawyer posing as my business consultant. He reviewed the files in front of me, stamped copies, and confirmed his name never should have been on those documents in the first place. I kept receipts, digital and physical. I wasn't planning revenge. I was building insurance, not the kind you buy, the kind you earn. By the time that smug email landed in my inbox, he was already legally boxed in. He just hadn't realized it yet. He thought he'd won. That he'd stripped me of my worth, my legacy, my security. But I had secured everything before he even packed his suitcase. And now the only thing left to do was let the consequences find him. I need you to breathe. I wasn't ready for that twist either. If your heart just dropped, tap the like button. It tells me I'm not the only one who felt it. And don't keep this story to yourself. Share it with someone who loves real-life drama as much as you do. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. I didn't hear his voice again that week, but I imagined it. I imagined the tremble behind his arrogance, the way his throat must have tightened when he sat across from a man in a suit and tie, expecting to dictate his next move, expecting to begin divorce proceedings like he was ordering from a menu. He thought it would be simple. A clean break. A few signatures. A division he believed he'd already decided. But that's not what he heard. According to my attorney, his lawyer leaned back in his chair, cleared his throat, and slid a folder across the polished desk. Inside were documents, court filings, bank records, legal notices. And at the top of the stack, one short letter, a cease and desist. The lawyer didn't mince words. You're no longer listed on any of the financial accounts. The property isn't shared. The assets aren't co-owned. And you may want to be careful with your next steps, because what you've done might fall under criminal conduct. He must have sat there stunned. I wonder if he even breathed, because this wasn't the script he'd written in his head. In his mind, I was still the woman who said yes before finishing my sentence, who cried quietly when ignored, who handed over passwords to make things easier. He underestimated silence. He misread calm. He mistook quiet for consent. And now, the ground beneath him had cracked open. He tried to call me. I saw the first ring, then the second. I didn't flinch. I didn't answer. I let the screen dim, let his name fade away, just as easily as he tried to erase mine. Then came the texts. At first short. Call me. Then confused. What is going on? And finally, desperate. We need to talk. Please. But I owed him nothing. Not a response. Not reassurance. Not clarity. He had written his chapter with lies. I had written mine with truth. By the time he was pacing a hotel lobby with panic in his voice, my world had already begun healing. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I was free. What he didn't understand, and maybe never would, was that I hadn't just prepared for his betrayal. I had protected myself from it. And for the first time in our entire story, he was the one standing on the outside looking in. He landed earlier than scheduled, rage disguising itself as urgency. I already knew he would. He was a man who always needed to control the narrative. He believed he could fix anything with presence and posture. But this time presence meant nothing. Posture couldn't open the door. Because the key he once had didn't work anymore. He stood in front of what used to be our home, bags in hand, jaw tight, blinking at the unfamiliar brass hardware. He rattled the knob, knocked, stepped back, looked around like the neighborhood might confirm something. But no one came. No one opened the door. And no one explained what had happened, because by then I had already gone. I'd left 2 days before his return. Not in haste. Not in hiding. With intention. Everything I owned, everything that mattered was already somewhere else. Somewhere safe. Somewhere he could no longer reach. There was no confrontation. I didn't know him theatrics. Instead he got silence. The kind that wraps around a man like a mirror. All his calls, his texts, his angry emails, they were redirected. His only point of contact now was my attorney. A woman as unshakable as marble, who responded to every one of his outbursts with exact language and documented restraint. He tried to play the victim. She's locking me out of my own life. But the paper trail said otherwise. Each forged signature, every unauthorized transfer archived. Each lie documented. And then came the second blow, the woman he had left everything for. The one who supposedly gave him everything I couldn't. She vanished the moment his finances froze. She ghosted his calls, deleted her socials, and emptied whatever joint funds he had created in her name. Turns out she never wanted him. She wanted the illusion he pretended to be. The version of himself he sold through designer belts and fine dining. But once the house wasn't his anymore, once the bank accounts were no longer fluid, once his name no longer carried power, her affection dissolved like sugar in water. That weekend, he found himself alone in a hotel room downtown. No wife. No mistress. No asset. Just the echo of his choices bouncing off the walls. He sat there with everything he thought he wanted gone. The life he destroyed to chase a fantasy, unraveling thread by thread. He tried to call me one last time. A blocked number. A voicemail that never reached me. But what could he even say? He'd chosen deception, and now he was waking up in the aftermath of it. Every lie he told had a receipt. Every move he made left a shadow. And now, the only thing left to witness it was the silence he once underestimated. I didn't run to a mansion. I didn't escape to some faraway paradise. I moved into a modest brick cottage tucked behind a line of cedar trees, a place where the air felt different, lighter, freer. There was no grand welcome, no champagne-soaked celebration. Just a new key, a clean countertop, and a silence that didn't haunt, but healed. It was strange, waking up without the weight of performing strength. I didn't need to walk on eggshells, or rehearse my tone, or study his face for signs of temper. I brewed coffee slowly, opened windows just because I could, sat barefoot on my porch while the sun pushed through the leaves. For the first time in years, I wasn't surviving, I was existing. My days took on new rhythm. No more carefully choreographed schedules revolving around his ego. Instead, I poured myself into something I wish I'd had years ago: community. I began speaking in quiet corners of local libraries and women's centers, not with microphones but with open journals and trembling honesty. I didn't tell them everything, but I told them enough. Enough to make another woman pause before signing what she didn't understand. Enough to spark questions, to light awareness. It started small: 2 or 3 attendees. A widow. A newlywed. A woman who hadn't worked in 10 years because her husband said she didn't need to. We sat in circles. We shared stories. We unlearned silence. And piece by piece, something inside me softened. I found a strange peace in budgeting my own bills. In making choices without approval. In buying a cheap chair because I liked the color. Not because it fit the aesthetic. I adopted a dog from the shelter. A clumsy mutt with one floppy ear and a bark too big for his body. I named him Murphy. He followed me everywhere like he understood what I'd been through. Evenings were quiet but full. I read novels again. I planted basil on the windowsill. I made pasta from scratch and burned it and laughed instead of crying. I laughed. Genuinely. For the first time in what felt like decades, I began to see myself. Not the version he sculpted, not the reflection that tried to please, but the raw, stubborn, curious woman I had long buried beneath compromise. It wasn't instant. There were nights I stared at the ceiling, wondering how I had stayed so long. But there were mornings when I looked in the mirror and didn't flinch. When I saw scars and didn't cover them. When I smiled, not for anyone else, not as armor, but because joy had quietly returned. I wasn't rebuilding the life I lost. I was building the one I'd never been allowed to dream of. One decision at a time. One breath at a time. And in that silence, in that stillness, I met myself again. Months passed. The seasons shifted without his shadow touching my doorstep. Then, on an ordinary afternoon, his name resurfaced in my inbox. Quiet, familiar, unwelcome. The subject line was simple. I've been thinking. I opened it without hesitation. Not out of curiosity, out of certainty. I already knew what was inside. He wrote like a man rewriting history. He remembered our backyard wedding, the string lights, the vows, the first apartment with the squeaky floor. He said he'd made a mistake. Called it confusion. Called it weakness. Called it anything but what it was, a choice. He apologized for the tone of his last email, as if tone was the wound. He said he'd been under pressure, that the other woman wasn't what he thought, that he'd lost himself. He told me he missed my steadiness, my loyalty, my patience. He missed the version of me that stayed. He tried to pull me backward with nostalgia. He tried to wrap betrayal in memory and hope I wouldn't notice the difference. I didn't rage. I didn't analyze. I didn't compose paragraphs to correct the story. I typed 12 words. You didn't lose me. You gave me away. On purpose. I hit send. Then I blocked him, email, phone, every path he could use to reach into the life I rebuilt without him. No final speech. No second closure. No audience. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was complete. I didn't wait to see if he wrote again. I didn't wonder how he took it. I didn't replay what-ifs. I closed the laptop, took Murphy for a walk, and let the evening air remind me that peace doesn't ask for permission. He chose his ending, and mine didn't include him. I never raised my voice. I never slammed a door, smashed a plate, or shouted into the void. I didn't chase him through text messages. I didn't show up to confront him. I didn't try to prove my worth to someone who had already discarded it. Instead, I stepped back, and I let him unravel. Every thread he pulled thinking he was building something better turned out to be the hem of his own unraveling. He thought I'd fall apart, that I'd break down quietly in some dark corner, waiting to be rescued. But I wasn't breaking. I was calculating. While he thought he was walking away with my money, I was walking away with my soul intact. He mistook silence for surrender. But silence was strategy. I didn't become vengeful. I became precise. I never leaked a word of what he did. Not to family, not to friends. Because I wanted the fallout to come from within. Let him explain to his parents why I disappeared. Let him answer when the mistress ghosted him after realizing his charm didn't pay the bills. Let him see my absence as the loudest consequence of all. I remembered what my therapist said once. Sometimes, revenge is not about hurting them. It's about refusing to let them hurt you again. I honored my values. I protected my future. And I gave him exactly what he deserved. A view of the door he never thought I'd walk through, and the echo of the life he could have had, fading forever out of reach. And that was how I took back my power without raising my voice. If this ending gave you chills or left you speechless, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because my next story might just be even wilder. And please drop a comment below. I read every single one. They always expect tears, screaming, begging, a public meltdown they can point to and say, "See? That's why I left." But sometimes, the most powerful revenge isn't chaos. It's composure. It's building quietly while they crumble loudly. It's reclaiming your voice without ever needing to raise it. Sometimes, the loudest form of revenge is silence, but not the silence of weakness. No. It's silence sharpened by clarity, backed by strategy, fueled by self-respect. To every woman listening, never let someone convince you that your worth is negotiable. Never hand your power to someone who only values it when it's gone. You are not disposable. You are the asset, the anchor, the foundation. And if someone fails to see that, let them watch you leave. Let them feel your absence. And may your glow, your growth, your grace be the only closure they ever get. This was your reminder. You don't always need to fight to win. Sometimes you just need to know when to walk and never look back.